There is enough hierarchy in the world to last a lifetime, but it should not be that way in the community of Christ. Antioch is where the church antes up on that conviction. Now, in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And that is a pretty fascinating list of names to start a church with. So let's do a roll call here. We'll start off with Barnabas. Now, Barnabas we know from earlier in Acts. He's actually introduced in chapter 4. And his real name is Joseph, or in some manuscripts, Joses. But he's given the nickname Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, because in his first appearance, he sells a plot of land that he owns, and he brings the proceeds to the church in Jerusalem to share with the poor. Now, what's interesting about Barnabas, and relevant for our story today, is that he is a Levite from Cyprus. And that tells us a couple interesting things about him. First of all, he is thoroughly ethnically Jewish. In fact, he's a Levite. So he's from the tribe that cared for temple worship in Jerusalem within that Levitical system. But he is also part of the diaspora. So he's not living in Jerusalem near the temple. He's from Cyprus, which is a little island off the coast of Syria, just north of Palestine, out in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's this story of Jesus that seems to draw him back to his faith. So he sells his land and he makes his way back to Jerusalem, and all of this to be part of this emerging Jesus movement that's happening. Okay, well then how does he end up in Antioch then? Well, his background is probably a big clue to the story, because the church in Antioch is a bit of an anomaly in itself. See, at the end of Acts chapter 7, persecution of the church breaks out in Jerusalem, and at its climax, one of the early leaders, a man named Stephen, is killed. He's actually martyred for his faith in Jesus. Now, who is there directing all of that violence? Well, it's actually Saul, who we also know is Paul, who also finds himself on the list of leaders in the Antiochian church, by the way. We'll get to him in a moment, because like any good Avengers film, there's a lot of interwoven threads going on right now. But initially, what happens is that because of this violence, the church in Jerusalem kind of disperses. In fact, at the start of chapter 8, we read that because of the violence, all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. It's actually Stephen's death that inadvertently first spreads the good news beyond Jerusalem. But from there, the story continues. So in chapter 9, Saul has an encounter on the Damascus road, converts to the way of Jesus. In chapter 10, Peter has his encounter, his vision, meets Cornelius, realizes that the story of Jesus extends beyond his ethnic boundaries. And then in chapter 11, we read that those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed had traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, spreading the good word only among the Jews. But then some of them, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks also, telling them about the good news of the Lord. And the Lord's hand was with them, and so a great number of people believed and turned to the way of Jesus. When news of this reached the church in Jerusalem, they sent Barnabas to Antioch to see what was up. So, all these stories are kind of happening at the same time right now, right? Like Saul, also known as Paul, is converting to the way of Jesus. Peter is converting to the idea that salvation has been extended to non-Jewish people. These scattered believers, completely independent of the apostles, are coming to a similar realization. And they're just moving ahead, telling people about Jesus, starting churches completely on their own without the oversight of the disciples. So the church in Jerusalem, who remember, it's full of all those OG apostles, they hear about this and they're like, well, we should probably see what's happening up there in Antioch. Let's send someone to go check up on things. Who we got? Well, we got Barnabas here. We know he's a good guy. He's Jewish like us. Also, though, he's already from Cyprus. He knows that area. He knows those people. Let's send him north to do some reconnaissance. Now, whether this is because the church in Jerusalem is skeptical of what's happening, or whether they just want to encourage them, that's up for speculation, hard to know for sure. But I do think history shows they choose the right person. Because as soon as he gets there, this is what we read. Barnabas arrived and saw what the grace of God was doing. He was immediately glad and encouraged them. Which, if you remember, is exactly what the name Barnabas meant. In the first place, the dude just does what he does. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, it means the church in Antioch is a related strain of Christianity. These were believers who first encountered the story of Jesus in Jerusalem, after all. But it's almost like Antioch is a parallel evolutionary path of the story of the church. It develops not just in a different city or even just a different culture and language, but in a very different way from the church in Jerusalem. It's not founded by the disciples. It's not built on the apostles. This is a ground-up, grassroots, lay-led explosion of good news. Which is why, then, going back to chapter 13, we hear that the leaders of this new church include Barnabas, who we've just talked about, a displaced Jewish man drawn back to his faith by Jesus, Simeon called Niger, which is literally something like Simeon the Black One, which to our ears probably sounds a little racially insensitive today, but actually is a very important point the writer is making here. The church is not what Jerusalem expected it to be, and the church in Antioch is not even the complexion that Jerusalem expected to see. There's Lucius of Cyrene, a man we realistically don't really know anything about, but who brings with him like a very Roman name. Like, this is not just a Gentile. This is someone that first century Jewish people would have almost instinctively heard as enemy because of that name. And then Simeon, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. That is a wild statement to read in the New Testament, because that is a reference to Herod Antipas. And that is the same guy who ruled over Galilee for 42 years and murdered John the Baptist a little earlier in the story. Now, the language here identifies Simeon as a suntrophos of Herod. That could mean childhood friend, but realistically probably refers to what we might call a foster brother. These were young boys that were brought into the royal court and raised alongside royal princes, essentially so that they would have peers as they grew up. And that meant Simeon was not at all part of the royal family, but he was raised in the royal court alongside the man who murdered the forerunner of Christ. Talk about guilt by association. And yet here he is leading the church in Antioch alongside the final name on our list here, Saul, who today we primarily know by his Roman name, Paul. And we're used to hearing a lot about Paul, but you gotta understand, at this point in the story, Paul has been incommunicado for about a decade now. He left Tarsus, or went for Tarsus in Syria and Cilicia, and nobody has heard from him since. But in chapter 11, Barnabas goes to Tarsus to find him, brings him out of retirement to help found this church in Antioch. Like, this is a murderer's row of characters that's listed here in chapter 13. If you're into Marvel movies, this is like more like the Thunderbolts than the Avengers, to be honest. And so if Peter thought his vision last week was a little destabilizing, just wait until Jerusalem gets a load of this. Barnabas, the expendable one. Simeon, the black one. Lucius, the Roman one. Simeon, the one guilty by association. And Saul, the one we never really trusted anyway, but thankfully we haven't heard from him in a decade either. That's who's leading a church that's popped up in Antioch. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for credentials. I have worked really hard on my degrees, for example. I think if you want to lead, you should be willing to put in the work to learn first. But at some point, if the only people we are ever willing to follow are the people that the establishment tells us we should, I think at some point we will find that our communities lack the diversity of perspective and history and calling and creativity that characterizes the kingdom of God, and what the Spirit seems to do despite us. A couple weeks ago, we heard Peter, in the very first sermon of the church era, quote from the prophet Joel and talk about how God will pour out Spirit on men and women, on young and old. And at the time, I said that we are better when we listen to each other, that there is enough hierarchy in the world to last a lifetime, but it should not be that way in the community of Christ. Antioch is where the church antes up on that conviction.